Hello, can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. Hi everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Katie. I'm an event staffer here at Politics and Prose, where we're back to hosting in-person events along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. We've also recently relocated both of our branch locations at Union Market and the Wharf and have started hosting events there as well. So for a full list of everything confirmed, you can visit our website at politics-prose.com. So before we get started today, a couple of boring housekeeping items. Please go ahead and silence your cell phones so to not disrupt the event. And then once we do get time for opening the floor to audience questions, we placed a standing microphone here at the end of the aisle. It's hidden behind this pillar for some of you. We do ask that if you're able to come to the microphone to ask your question that you do so. That way it's captured in our audio and video recording of today. After we finish with the Q&A, we will be doing a signing at this table. So if you've not already purchased the book, we have plenty of copies behind the register. So on to the better part of this introduction. Today, I'm very excited to welcome David Daley to talk about his new book, Antidemocratic, Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. David Daley is the author of the national bestseller, the national bestseller, Rat Effed, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, which helped spark the drive to reform gerrymandering. He regularly discusses democracy and voting rights on CNN and MSNBC, NPR, and other outlets. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and The Guardian, among other publications. He is the former editor-in-chief of Salon and currently lives in Massachusetts. Daley will be in conversation this afternoon with Colby Itkowitz. Itkowitz has covered Washington policy and politics for most of her career and is now focusing on voting and democracy issues. Since coming to the Washington Post in March 2014, she's covered presidential and congressional campaigns, redistricting, okay, I'm having trouble pronouncing today, but we all know where I'm going with this. Redistricting, Congress, and anchored the Inspired Life blog. She also wrote about the quirks of the federal government and campaigns for the famed In the Loop column. She was previously the Morning Call's DC correspondent, and she began her journalism career in Washington at Congressional Quarterly. So please join me in welcoming today to Politics and Prose, David and Colby.
Hello, everybody. Thank you.
Hi. All right. You ready?
I am.
Thank you so much for inviting me to do this.
Thank you for doing it.
I wanted to kick off by saying how we met, which was a couple of years ago after the 2020 census. The Washington Post asked me to take on the topic of redistricting, which I knew absolutely nothing about. And so I cold emailed Dave and asked him if he would let me ask him a few questions. And he was so kind with his time, his knowledge, his resources, and he quickly became a mentor and a friend. So I'm just honored that you asked me to do this with you here today.
Thank you for being here. You are one of the very best people on this beat, and I'm so glad you are on this beat, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, and a pleasure to be here at Politics and Prose, which is one of the very great bookstores anywhere, so this is wonderful.
I wanted to start, before we get to the current book, I remember you telling me that your interest in gerrymandering began when Congress couldn't get gun safety laws passed. And I wondered if you could tell the audience a little bit about how you connected those dots, why the absence of being able to pass meaningful gun laws led you to gerrymandering. And 3 books in now, but.
Sure. You have a good memory, first of all, for these conversations we had a long time ago. But no, I was the editor-in-chief of Salon for many years, and this would have been about 2013. And we had just had the shooting at Sandy Hook, and we had just had our son, who's now 11, and the shooting happened in Connecticut, where I had grown up, and it just seemed as if every day at Salon, what we were covering was becoming more and more extreme and sort of disconnected from the reality of what Americans wanted their Congress to do. You had 50-something votes that year to repeal Obamacare, which just was not going to happen, right? And I asked a really simple question, which I suppose launched me on 12 years of work, which was, if we reelected Barack Obama in 2012, if Democrats gained seats in the US Senate that year, what happened in the House? And what I learned was, well, Democratic candidates won 1.4 million more votes than Republican candidates that year. And then you take a look at some of the states that Obama carried, states like Pennsylvania, where the margin in 2008 and the margin in 2012 was not particularly different at the presidential level, at the statewide level. And yet in 2008, you had a 12-7 Democratic delegation, and after the 2012 election, it went to 13-5 Republican. And I said, well, that's kind of interesting. What happened? And well, what happened in between was the 2010 census and the 2011 redistricting, and a project called Red Map, which is short for the Redistricting Majority Project, which was a really sophisticated Republican strategy to use redistricting as a power lever to take control, to kind of recognize that the power in redistricting occurs in state legislatures, and that if you could capture state legislatures in all of these swing states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Alabama, Florida, it's the same story state after state, by winning about 116 state legislative seats across a little more than a dozen states, Republicans were able to take control of the state houses. They were able to draw themselves maps. And then when you draw these uncompetitive districts, you elect and send to Washington a different kind of member, a kind of member who's not particularly apt to compromise, and an awful lot of the extremism in our politics, I think, can be traced to what started that year.
And, most people, when they talk about threats to democracy, they think about the aftermath of Donald Trump. But what your latest book kind of details for us is that these threats to democracy began decades ago as a reaction to the Voting Rights Act. And so maybe you can walk us through a little bit about how, when the Voting Rights Act passed, this kind of started this groundswell of conservative backlash.
That's a great question. I think that's right, that we like sometimes to think that this moment of peril in our politics started when Donald Trump descended down that elevator in Trump Tower in the summer of 2015. And I would suggest that most of the key events that brought us here actually happened a lot earlier than that. Certainly the redistricting that set so much of this in motion happened 5 years earlier. Certainly the key decisions that I write about in this book, whether we're talking about Citizens United and campaign finance, whether we're talking about Shelby County versus Holder that really began the slow and steady evisceration of the Voting Rights Act, it all precedes Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump is able to create the kinds of chaos in the aftermath of this election that it appears that is underway right now before our very eyes, he is relying in many ways, right, on the gerrymandered state legislatures enacting policies that the Supreme Court has allowed them to go ahead and pass after the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act. So he is, his entire strategy depends upon things that were put in place far before his very emergence on the scene. But I think you can also trace this back much further. And this book tries to tell a 5-decade story, really, of court capture and opposition to the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965. August of 1965, it's signed into law by President Johnson. The very first challenge comes in September of 1965 from the state of South Carolina, which says, well, this isn't fair. You're not treating every state equally, and we really don't need this here anymore. Everything is fine. And that argument was knocked aside by the Warren Court. It would take about 38 years 48 years for that argument to win at the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was not a matter of things changing in the South when the Voting Rights Act is reauthorized in 2006 by a unanimous Congress, by a Congress controlled by Republicans. It comes with a 16,000-page document detailing exactly why preclearance was still so necessary in so many parts of the country. Modern examples of elections being canceled and precincts being moved without telling anybody, and all kinds of chicanery going on. But what had happened over that time is that the justices on the court had changed, and that conservatives realized that, and they especially realized this through the various reauthorization fights for the Voting Rights Act, that if you wanted to get rid of something that was as popular as this, something that was really as American as apple pie and baseball and jazz, you couldn't do so through the political process. You had to do it differently. You had to do it via judicial fiat. And so that they really went about this process of trying to win the courts over 50 years that I think has been super effective. And certainly you can see the handiwork of the current Chief Justice, who's not here today, is he? In so many of these steps along the way.
I mean, you write that race was the motivation for a lot of this, that there was a sense, maybe a fear, I'll let you describe it, of all of this equality, these efforts to ensure that people of color had the same voting rights as everybody else. And there was a serious backlash to that, and that race has kind of been the undercurrent of all of this over the last 50 years.
I think that's right. I mean, in many ways, this book is called Antidemocratic, not because I disagree personally with these decisions, but because there's an anti-democratic spirit that has run through American history, really from the very beginning, that the question of who has the vote and who holds power has been extraordinarily contested. And I think we like sometimes to think of the moral arc of the universe always bending toward justice, and that perhaps the history of America is the slow, steady progress with the vote slowly being expanded over time and more people being brought in. But what I would suggest is that while some of that might be true, that the fuller, more complete story is that every step of the way has brought backlash, and that every step of the way this has been deeply contested, and that in many ways I would suggest that the truest articulation of American ideals comes from the Reconstruction amendments that ended the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that extended Black citizenship and ended slavery and created the idea of equal protection under the law, which becomes one person, one vote. And what we saw in the 1870s is that the U.S. Supreme Court is what put an end to the Reconstruction dream before the contested election of 1876 that most history books point to as the end of Reconstruction. You had court decisions in the Cruikshank cases and the Civil Rights Act cases, and there's wonderful books on all of these probably here that I would recommend, that the court kept saying, well, how much longer must we do this? How much longer must we extend special advantages, they would say, to Black citizens? It's 5 years after the Civil War. I would suggest perhaps a little bit longer might be appropriate. And what the court did in those decisions really set the stages for 100 years of Jim Crow, which is only ended by the Voting Rights Act. And as soon as the Voting Rights Act appears on the scene, you see the same kind of determined resistance. You see the new poison in old bottles that just continues. That the Chief Justice in Shelby County says that things have changed, but I would suggest that the record shows a little bit different.
Well, so the book, speaking of the Chief Justice, the book really documents kind of his idea, how he kind of got his ideology. And you write that he believed that race wasn't an issue anymore in America, and that a lot of his decisions since then have reflected that belief by a lot of conservatives that we shouldn't be thinking about race anymore. We see it in the affirmative action case. The book also, when it comes to the Chief Justice, tries to upend this idea that he's the moderate voice on the court. And you point to a lot of these voting rights decisions. And so maybe you can take us a little bit through kind of the evolution of John Roberts, and then we can come and talk about some of those individual cases that you refer to.
The Chief Justice is born he grows up in Long Beach, Indiana. And when he is appointed, nominated by President Bush to become a Chief Justice, he talks about his upbringing, and he talks about being surrounded by fields of corn and silos pointing to the horizon as far as the eye can see. He grew up, though, in something other than that kind of John Cougar song that he is suggesting. He grew up in an extraordinarily wealthy town that was really a suburb of Chicago on the lakefront. His dad is an executive at Bethlehem Steel. He has summer jobs that pay him in the early 1970s between $16 and $20 an hour, which is somewhere between $85 and $103 an hour today. It's a pretty good summer gig. This is effectively a town for whites only, and that is exactly what Long Beach's brochures selling itself to the world advertised. Long after anti-housing discrimination laws are passed, Long Beach is still advertising itself as a place for Caucasian Gentiles only. So this is where John Roberts grows up, is educated in the private schools, in the Catholic schools, goes on to Harvard and Harvard Law, onto a clerkship with Justice Rehnquist, who himself, in his days in Arizona, personally blocked Latino voters from the polls in Arizona, and goes into the Reagan administration as his first job in the Department of Justice in the fall of 1981. And this is the man who is given the portfolio of voting rights right on the verge of the 1982 reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, right? So while John Lewis is being beaten on the bridge in Selma, while freedom riders are crossing Mississippi, dying, trying to register voters, while Lyndon Johnson is muscling the Voting Rights Act through Congress, John Roberts, is playing lacrosse in Long Beach. He has never been touched by any of these issues, and yet he is handed the responsibility for them. And I think what you can see in that moment, and I went back and I found all of the memos and the talking points and the op-eds that he wrote in those days, and you can see how the Chief Justice's mind works on these issues. He has never had to personally experience or relate to any of them. And so, as he says in these memos, we should not make it too easy to prove a Voting Rights Act violation. Certainly, this has been his life's work, I would suggest.
You mentioned, and this is a very educated audience, but you mentioned the word preclearance earlier, and I hoped that maybe you could kind of explain what that means and what some of the protections in the Voting Rights Act were to ensure that people of color had the right to vote, and how the Roberts Court has worked to upend those.
Preclearance is the most effective enforcement mechanism that the Voting Rights Act had. It was included because nothing else worked. The Civil Rights Acts of the 1950s left the enforcement to localities in the South where they were not going to actually enforce the law or make any changes, where the sheriffs and the local judges were also segregationists. So what Congress said in 1965 is, listen, the places that have the worst track record on voting and passing these barriers and restrictions, you are going to have to run any changes you want to make by the Department of Justice or a court in Washington, D.C. first. And we're going to have to take a look at it and say if it's okay.
And so then what did the Roberts courts do with preclearance? What was the decision in Shelby versus Holder?
What Shelby County did was it put an end to preclearance. It effectively it did so by freezing the formula that was used to determine who was covered and who was under this. And what Roberts said was that, well, things have changed in the South. He could not offer any actual evidence to this. And Congress, just 7 years earlier, when it reauthorized the Voting Act so overwhelmingly, had presented thousands and thousands of pages of evidence saying why it was still needed. Roberts overturns it. And he does so under really deeply deceptive and disingenuous ways. He creates what he says is a tradition of equal sovereignty among the states. The trouble with this is that it doesn't exist. He makes it up out of the equal footing doctrine, which governs how states are added to the Union. There had been earlier court precedent going back in voting rights law that made it clear that the equal footing doctrine had nothing to do with voting. Roberts simply edits out the sentence from that precedent that he doesn't like. He just uses an ellipsis, pretends as if it's not even there. He includes a chart that suggests that voting turnout has evened amongst blacks and whites across the South. This is based on a misreading of census data. His entire chart is flawed. So what little evidence he has to offer in this is wholly manufactured and wrong. And he effectively disembowels what had been the most successful civil rights legislation in the history of the country on a pile of lies. And, you know, as you said, this is the justice who is credited and has defined himself as a caller of balls and strikes, right? Well, you know, this is calling balls and strikes like Leslie Nielsen in Naked Gun, right? You know, I mean, as soon as the pitch is thrown, he's doing a dance and calling it. Roberts had been waiting for this moment for more than 4 decades. When it arrived, he grabbed it.
And so have we seen, what are the real world implications of the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act? What have we seen states, these gerrymandered state legislatures do with that decision?
Roberts said that things had changed in the South. Well, it took about an hour to prove that things had not changed in the South. That's how long it took for Texas to enact its draconian voter ID law that had been frozen because the federal government was not willing to allow it, because the state of Texas would admit in litigation that they knew full well that this ID bill was going to keep about somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 Latino citizens from voting. People who were fully eligible to vote, but who the state had researched the very forms of ID they were least likely to have and then required those, which is very similar to something North Carolina did in the weeks after this as well. So what you see is state after state. Jim Sensenbrenner, who'd been a congressman from Wisconsin, Republican, who was overseeing much of the 06 reauthorization, he said to me that what Roberts did was remove the prison guard, and then all of the prisoners just ran out. And state after state after state, you begin to see the after effects of this in the laws that have been passed, whether the precinct closures, whether purges of voting rolls, whether the redistricting that followed in 2021, in which those states would have previously been required to clear their maps, did not have to, and states where all of the population gains were being driven by minority voters and voters of color then lose political power in these states like Texas and elsewhere. So much of this can be attributed to Shelby County and the ending of preclearance. And like we were saying at the beginning, so much of what could still come in those 6 weeks in between the election and the Electoral College also very much shaped by the end of preclearance.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get to that. But you say something near the end of the book where you say that the supermajority on the Supreme Court, the conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, could be in place now through 2065. That date was pretty stunning to me. We've already seen what the supermajority, some of the decisions they've made, decisions around abortion. I referenced affirmative action. I think people look at the court and think, well, if that's the last stop, does it matter if we have a Democratic president? Does it matter if we have Democrats in Congress? If the Supreme Court is there as kind of a stop and it's a conservative supermajority for the next, until my daughter is a grown lady. So,
I worry about it the same way with my son, right? I mean, if Justice Barrett serves as long as Justice Ginsburg, my son, who's 11 now, will be something, I think, in his early 60s, which is a wild thought to imagine. I think it matters that we have a Democratic president, in that what we need to be thinking about is how we reform a runaway, renegade, corrupt court. And that what we need to do is take full advantage of this moment to try and imagine the kinds of political reforms that could fix it. And I don't say this as a partisan. I say this as in the same spirit that upwards of 70% of Americans believe in the idea of a binding ethics code that's enforceable for these justices, the idea that closer to 3/4 of all Americans believe in the idea of term limits for these justices. I think that there is something really uncomfortable to probably all of us about the idea that anybody in a representative democracy ought to hold that kind of power for life, and be unaccountable, to make your decisions in private, to be bound by no ethics code, to be unelected. If you go back and look at what David Souter had to say when he stepped down, Justice Souter was, I think, very uncomfortable with being one of those 9 people invested with that kind of power. And I think we ought to be thinking really seriously about this, especially in this moment where this court has really thrust itself forward in many ways as an extra constitutional a legislature almost. I mean, we have 9 justices. In many ways, it would be better off if we put them in blue and red robes and kind of like NASCAR made them wear patches on their robes. Koch Industries or the various trips that they've been sent on. Courtesy of which funder. But I think if we're going to have this, we deserve to know who is paying their kids' tuition. We deserve to know who bought their mom's home and is allowing her to live in it rent-free. We deserve to know all of these things.
This wasn't in the book, but you wrote a piece recently in The Guardian about the presidential election in a couple weeks. What would happen if it ended up in the hands of the Supreme Court? And I think I texted you and said, well, that's terrifying. So could you kind of walk us through in this, this absolute worst case scenario, how would we get there that we would have the Supreme Court deciding our next president?
I think there's any number of scenarios that could throw this towards the courts. We already saw in 2000, this has happened once before, right? The state of Florida is so close in 2000 that the battle over recounts extends throughout that 6-week period ahead of the Electoral College. A vote in the middle of December, and that the Supreme Court effectively closes down the recount. And that was the end of the election. So the best example to me right now, I think people ought to be keeping an eye on Georgia, where you have a state election board that has been up to all kinds of no good with regards to trying to require a hand count or to give local officials that have been carefully placed in positions of power in these counties the ability to question results or to say that they suspect fraud or wrongdoing, even if there's no actual evidence of this. So the process of slowing down certification, of creating chaos, of just kind of throwing this into the courts in the days and weeks after the election, I think is really a terrifying one. But we see that there are dozens of lawsuits in dozens of states with exactly this goal. And if they are able to make it to the Supreme Court, which I think is the very likely destination, they will be heard by a court with a 6-member conservative supermajority, 5 of which were nominated by presidents that lost the popular vote, 3 of which worked as lawyers and proved their loyalty to the conservative legal movement on the Bush versus Gore case, 1 of whom flew the insurrectionist flag outside their house, and the others, another whose wife has been close with the Stop the Steal movement itself. So do we have wine or bourbon here or anything? Because if this is where it goes, I don't think anybody should be surprised at how it ends, because this is the very reason why those justices are there. Bush versus Gore was proof of concept for how effective court capture can be. And so If this is close enough to land in the courts, I think all bets are off. And Al Gore in 2000 stepped aside quite gracefully. The court had a different level of respect and legitimacy in the eyes of the public. I mean, I worry very deeply about what happens if this court, wearing their NASCAR robes, makes that kind of decision now.
I don't want to spoil the end of your book for anyone, but you have a great scene at the end that finds you on the doorstep of retired Justice Anthony Kennedy. And I was wondering if you could just walk us through kind of that experience, kind of knocking on his door. I think you write that he's doing his dishes at the sink, and you're face to face.
Justices are just like you and me.
And you're face to face with the justice, and what you wanted to ask him, and the response that you got.
This was the same day that somebody showed up outside Justice Kavanaugh's house. So I got a whole bunch of texts that morning saying, "Dave, that wasn't you at Kavanaugh's house, was it?" No. Justice Kennedy wrote the decision in Citizens United. He was one of the 5 in the Shelby County decision that ended preclearance. And he was the driving force in many ways behind the punt on partisan gerrymandering. And then he retired. And he had the opportunity to go the other way in some of those cases. And over the course of the decade or so that followed, I think it became pretty clear that the courts were the only thing that could have stepped in to put an end to partisan gerrymandering, that dark money in our politics, maybe not a great idea, and that things had not changed in the South as much as people had imagined when they wrote Shelby County. So I wanted to talk to Kennedy about it. He didn't really return my interview requests, so I just took a car out to his house one morning in McLean and knocked on the door. And he was washing dishes, had a towel over his shoulder. I came over jauntily enough, and I said just this, that I was working on a book that involved Shelby County, and I was curious as to whether he had any second thoughts, whether anything had happened in the last decade that had made him think that maybe that decision wasn't a great idea. And his face just sort of took on an entire different complexion. It went dark very quick. And the door, which had been slightly open, was suddenly slammed close, and he said, no regrets. What would there even be to possibly regret, or something along those lines, and slammed the latch and added another no regrets for emphasis and closed the door in my face. And that was that.
And with that, we'd love to take some questions from the audience. So anyone that has questions for Dave, please step up to the mic.
So you're absolutely right.
Thank you.
I was born in the 1940s, and I lived through all of this and watched it. I started Yale Law School in 1969, and I stopped law in the 1980s because I saw no point. I could see which way things were going. But it seems to me that you're not going back far enough, that all of this really got going in 1968, when Nixon adopted the Southern strategy. And my question is, it was the Southern strategy that did all this. Johnson said, we've lost the South for a generation. In fact, we lost the South totally for good. But nobody, and everyone talks about race, But nobody talks about business. And it seems to me that the Southern strategy was a way for the Republicans who represented business and bitterly opposed the New Deal, in which I was born, use that to get the votes, to get in their pro-business agenda, which was never popular. I mean, it started with Arizona, 1964, Barry Goldwater. That's what they wanted, and that's where the money comes from, and that's why Citizens United was such a disaster. But nobody talks about that. They talk about race as being the driving factor, and I think it's business and money. And Mitch McConnell, that's why he arranged, I don't think Mitch McConnell cares much about abortion one way or the other, or race. He cares about money and business. And that's why he managed to get a Supreme Court, which is so pro-business, it's pathetic. I mean, they've now gotten rid of Chevron, which will be the end of the New Deal.
That's a great question. And it's why this book starts with the Powell memo that was written by Lewis Powell, who was a pro-business corporate lawyer in the state of Virginia in the 1960s, very concerned about the direction of the country. It doesn't like the liberals running the media, the liberals on campus, doesn't much like the civil rights movement, doesn't much like Brown versus Board of Education.
Doesn't like regulation. He wrote it for the Chamber of Commerce.
He writes this memo for the Chamber of Commerce and says big business has to get involved in the fight, and the best place for big business to put its money is in the courts.
Right.
And Lewis Powell, 3 months later, finds himself nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is the most effective memo. I think we've all written memos that have gone nowhere, right? This memo got Lewis Powell on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Correct.
3 months later, where he proceeds over the course of the 1970s to deliver some of the campaign finance cases that are so crucial to unwinding Citizens United, whether we're talking about the Bilotti decision or some of the others in the 1970s. He is the driving force behind Mobile v. Bolden, which is one of the crucial voting rights cases of the 1970s that's deeply influential on John Roberts, that forms the crux of John Roberts' opposition to the Voting Rights Act reauthorization in 1982. So there's a real through line here from Powell
and I went to
through Roberts on all of these things.
I went to medical school. I couldn't take it anymore.
Thank you.
Hi, Dave. Rich Robinson, concerned citizen. I'm hoping that you could leave us with a crumb or two of optimism, because I'm sure we're all pretty depressed here. Are there any reforms that the United States can take to try to elect officials that might be able to do something legislatively to reform the court, to reform how laws are passed and what laws are passed?
It's a great question. Thank you, Rich. I think that there's a lot of reforms on the table. You here in Washington, D.C. Right now have the opportunity to vote on ranked choice voting in November, and I heartily endorse that local initiative, which I think would go a long way towards giving voters more choice and more voice, allowing independent voters the opportunity to vote, really ensuring that you have winners with an actual majority behind you. What I think we have seen so often around the country, especially in gerrymandered uncompetitive districts, is that you have folks being elected with just a plurality. In low turnout party primaries that take place in July and August, and that when you are able to win with 22, 23% of the vote, you simply run a different kind of campaign and you appeal to different voters. And once you're in office, you behave differently. And I think that reforms like ranked choice voting go a long way towards kind of changing the incentives in our politics. So that is one that is on the ballot right here that I think you can all feel optimistic about. I think there's a lot of things we have to think about as as comes to the Supreme Court, and I think that the kinds of ethics reforms that are on the table, the term limits packages that are on the table, people sometimes act as if it would be very difficult to do this. This has extraordinary popularity across the board amongst Democrats, Republicans, Independents. I think it simply requires some politicians with the willpower to push it through. I think we have to start thinking about how we fix and reform the U.S. Senate. It's been said that by 2035, 70% of the population will live in 15 states with 30 senators, which leaves the other 30% of the population with 70 senators, smaller, whiter, rural states. Senator Moynihan said back in the 90s that perhaps the time has come to think about this, and it's been 30 years, and that problem's only deepened. So big structural reforms are necessary, but there's a lot of them that have been proven to work, and been implemented around the country in ways that I think can really offer actual hope and optimism.
I swear I came here just to get a magazine, and I heard your talk. So
maybe you'd like a book as well.
I got the book. Got the book. So the slow ebb of the far right to erode voting rights. But what does it say about folks like Elon Musk, who says openly that only alpha, and he may have said alpha white males, but he said only alpha males should vote. Is that a victory for that slow ebb to say, wow, we got a captain of industry saying only alpha white men should vote? What does that say?
Probably means I couldn't vote. No, I think he owns a pretty big social media platform, I hear. Where the conversation has gone on this topic really fast, I think is pretty dangerous, right? But if you go back 40, 45 years and look at what Paul Weyrich was saying, the conservative activist before social conservatives in the early 1980s, it was being really clear that we don't want to expand the vote to everybody. It's not good for us when everybody votes. And the quiet part, I think, is being said louder and louder these days.
And speaking of Elon Musk, he's been kind of at the forefront of some of these kind of stop the steal type rhetoric ahead of this election. We see him on his social media account, warning of the threats of non-citizen voters, warning that Democrats are bringing people across the border just to vote for them. What do you make of Elon Musk's kind of involvement in this idea and the Trump rhetoric against the integrity of our elections?
I think you and a lot of other reporters at the Post have done a great job in talking about this and really setting us up. And you probably ought to answer your own question, because what is happening before our eyes, I think, is a real attempt to delegitimize an election before it's even happened, to sow that kind of fear and doubt without any evidence, without, indeed, to the contrary, it's actually false. Non-citizen voting is not a thing. migrants coming across the border to vote is not a thing. But the more that it gets repeated and the more that it gets amplified, it becomes a thing. And when you get folks like Musk who have platforms that amplify this, when you have gerrymandered legislatures in state after state filled with extremists who believe it and pass laws in order to stop a problem that doesn't exist, that then creates new problems that put barriers before people that they don't actually want to vote, when you have a US Supreme Court that in the Brnovich case and others has said, well, anything that a legislature does to try to stop voter fraud is fine if that's what they think they're doing. All of that comes together, I think, to create a really dangerous cocktail, especially when you have a candidate at the top of the ticket who is willing to say that he won an election that he lost, and his followers are willing to believe it.
Yes.
Hi. Mary Lou, a great book, and thank you for writing it. As a determined but slightly depressed Democrat, as the Republicans were plotting and scheming all these many years, what in the hell were the Democrats doing? And are there any now in my party who've gotten the message?
Boy, that's a great question. I think that much of what, somebody asked earlier about this starting in 1968, and I think that's right, because so much of this current backlash is a response to the expansion of rights under the Warren Court. And I think an awful lot of the liberal legal establishment still sees that the Warren Court as what this court is. They believe in the institution. They believe in the idea that the US Supreme Court is a beacon of equal justice under the law, whereas what it has become, I think, is the central hub of Republican political power. And there's a disconnect between how I think liberals see the court and the institution and how it's been, shall we say, hijacked over decades. And so there has not been a commensurate response on the other side, I think, to it. You look at what happened in 2016, if Democrats saw the court as the hub of political power, they would have fought harder for Merrick Garland in 2016. If they saw it as the hub of political power, they might have pushed Justices Breyer and Ginsburg to step down earlier than they had. Certainly in 2020, when people tried to urge Joe Biden towards court reform, he was not particularly there. But now, after Dobbs, after the immunity decision, we're seeing the beginning of a fight back. I think if we could get Senator Whitehouse as the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, that would go an awful long way. That there are groups now, the Court Accountability Project, all kinds of folks who I think are working on this, but it has to be mainstreamed. I wrote a book about gerrymandering 10 years ago that had a title that I can't say up here because my publisher said, well, you're talking about this boring topic no one knows about. You can't use the most boring word in the world to talk about it. And now I think people know what gerrymandering is, So I think what we need to do is to think as long-term as that and to understand that it's going to be a long-term fight. That is not what anybody wants to hear, because the reality is that this court is going to be in other hands probably for much of our lifetime and perhaps much of our kids' lifetime. But it's going to take a concerted effort to turn that around.
I wanted to leave this gentleman with a little bit of optimism. I know we're here to talk about your third book, but your second book actually was optimistic. And maybe you can talk a little bit, just as we close here, about the things that citizens have done to try to correct these things, to try to make it so that we don't have partisan politicians drawing their own lines and picking their own voters, and how we have seen, despite all the scary things we've talked about today, we have seen a slow and steady march towards some reforms in some states that, if it continues on that trajectory, we could see some changes.
Some really remarkable things have happened. You look at the state of Michigan, where one of the most gerrymandered states in the country 15 years ago, citizens came forward in 2018 behind a young woman who puts a post on Facebook that says, "I want to do something about gerrymandering in my state." And it leads to a statewide drive and hundreds of thousands of people coming together, collecting signatures, and winning a constitutional amendment that creates a citizens commission that drew lines in 2021 that, get this, the party that wins the most votes will control the most seats, kind of the way it ought to be. So that's a real step forward. You look at states like Idaho. I did a chapter in the last book on Idaho where there were young people who wanted to expand Medicaid, who were frustrated that the state would not take advantage of the Obamacare money. And they bought an old RV and they drove it around the state collecting signatures. They got what they needed, and they won in November of 2018 with more than 60% of the vote. And so then when there was a pandemic 2 years later, the state that really depends on rural hospitals was able to keep people alive because they went ahead and did that work. We have seen it on ranked choice voting here in Washington, also in Maine, in Alaska, on the ballot this year in an additional 4 states, some of them along with open primaries. This is difficult, hard work that has to be done by citizens collecting signatures, putting their time in, going out in the cold, knocking on doors, going to football games and farmers markets and putting in the hours. But I think what it shows is that when we come together like this, that there isn't any barrier that we can't knock down. A democracy is a verb. It's not a noun. It's something we have to do actively. It's something we have to try to perfect. The arc does not bend towards justice on its own. It only bends when all of us grab it and pull it, because there's people trying to pull it the other way. So it really requires all of our hands on it. But I think the beautiful thing is that this shows in red states, in purple states, in blue states, that there is more that unites us than divides us, that so much of what we have seen that is anti-democratic is not being done based on strength. It's being done based on fear. It's being done out of desperation. And that what it requires is us all standing up to fight it, knowing that it can be done, knowing that it can be won, and knowing that the challenges that we face now are nothing compared to the challenges that folks who came before us had to fight and win. These are simply the challenges of our time and our moment.
Great. All right. Well, Dave, thank you so much.
Thank you, Colby.
Thank you for this. And I think you're going to sign some books.